Good morning, everybody. It is Monday, April 14th, the day after the Masters, and a great day to be talking NFL draft coming up in just 10 days from now. It's coming up very quickly. Spring is shifting. We've got sun outside. The weather is shifting. It's a pretty great Monday to begin the week, and this is going to be maybe a bit of a different video than what might be expected. I'm kind of taking a detour from the traditional draft coverage in a way that is sort of presented from a betting perspective and going a little bit out into left field. And so whether you're watching on YouTube this morning, you're listening to the podcast on Apple or Spotify, bear with me as we go through this. I think it's going to be an interesting day to look at offensive players today and then defensive players tomorrow in this format. And so what I have done over the weekend, and for those of you watching on YouTube, you can see it is a stack, and I mean a stack of paper, over 100 pages of anonymous scout comments that were all off of the record, that were curated and put together in the draft guide by Bob McGinn, who's been a sports writer for more than 40 years over at golongtd.com. This is Tyler Dunn's Substack and website. I have messaged Tyler. He has given the green light for me to reference this in videos and then upcoming newsletters. And so what Bob has done is put together a ton of coach commentary as well as executive commentary, but more importantly, scouting commentary that has been provided to him off the record. All of it's anonymous. And he's gone through all of these players on offense and defense that are going to go in the first 4 or 5 rounds projected in the NFL draft. And I've kind of put everything together and pulled out important notes as it pertains to where some of these top players might end up going. Are they top 10? Are they top 20? Are they first round? Are they second round? And in a sea of sort of coach comments, GM comments, Daniel Jeremiah, Todd McShay, all of these expert draft analysts, presentations that are being put together and sort of curated, I've gone a little bit of a different direction, said, what are the guys working for these teams saying off the record about some of these players, and how might it pertain to betting the draft if they were allowed to do so? Now, as I put in the description of this, in no way is any of this implying that these NFL scouts are actually betting on the draft themselves. And I'm not trying to say that they are. I'm just trying to say, hey, here's what they've been saying. And if we're going to use this and put it against some of the odds that are posted, here's a different perspective past the coach and GM and draft expert commentary that I just don't see referenced a lot in the betting community. And we can look at that specifically. So that's the direction that I'm going with this show. And I'm going to do it tomorrow for the defensive players as well. And it's going to be a lot of looking down and looking to the side, because there's a ton of papers here that we are going to get to. So we'll start off with the wide receivers specifically. And again, if you guys want to read the entire draft breakdown, I highly recommend golongtd.com is the website specifically, and you can get the Bob McGinn draft guide. It's about 120,000 words total on all the different positions, and I highly recommend reading it if you're a football fan and you just want to get like a little bit more from it or get a bit of a different perspective. Highly recommend doing it. It's very insightful. It is a very different way than what is being written about online to look at some of these players. I think it's really great. We'll start with the wide receivers, and there's about 4 or 5 guys here that we can look at and talk about. So for Ted McMillan specifically, he was referred to by one scout as a lesser version of Rome Odunze, who went 9th overall in last year's draft. There were references to his volleyball skills in high school. There was some conversation about whether or not his feet and his ability on routes are good enough to be sustained as a true number 1 wide receiver. But the quote that stood out the most to me with McMillan is that he is viewed as a 16 to 25 type pick in the first round. Now, there are no over-unders posted for him from a positional standpoint on an over-under. We're going to see that posted a little bit later in the week. There is speculation that he could go as high as 7 to Carolina, but he's also viewed as a guy that's going to go in that early teens range. Dallas at number 12 has been a team that's very much tied to him. And so looking at that 16 to 25 range, that was the quote that stood out to me specifically. There were kind of criticisms of him being in protection mode last year, trying to get to the draft and how that's viewed. But the pick that, or the quote that stood out to me the most was that 16 to 25 range. Matthew Golden, specifically, I have nothing highlighted in the middle of the page for Matthew Golden because there was not really any speculation on where he was going to go. But my takeaway from this is all the wide receivers that were listed, there were about 14 guys that were listed as I looked through this. He was the one guy that didn't have a lot of negative commentary around him. There's some doubts on this 4.29 speed if it translates to the field, but there wasn't anything tied to Golden. There was nothing that stood out in a big or a negative way, and there wasn't a lot to take away from Golden. So I still think we're going to see him with the wide receiver number 2 context in the draft. Whether he's tied to Dallas as he visited last week, hard to say, but he certainly seems like he is a first-round guy in that mid-range of the first round, and that 40 time. Also ETR, it was Levitan he had on Mike Renner, and they were speculating whether that time is real or not. But it was an interesting clip if you guys haven't seen it. But this is one of the wide receivers in the group that didn't have any negative commentary, nothing overly positive, and nothing tied to a pick range. Luther Burden was wide receiver number 3 in the rankings, which might catch people by a bit of surprise because Emeka Egbuka is really wide receiver number 3 in a lot of the odds and a lot of the rankings. Luther Burden was ahead of him, but there was a comment right in the middle of the breakdown that says he's a really good slot receiver that can give you some outside, but with the character, I don't know how you can draft him in the first round. So there was a scout really kind of doubting that he could be a first-round draft pick right on the fringe. We've seen some more character stuff pop up recently. Another scout said he's a shaky first rounder and a little bit more of a second rounder because nobody can give a clean sign off on the character traits that he brings to a team. So all of a sudden there's kind of a range here put on Burden to being more of a second round guy. And why I think that's specifically interesting coming from the scout side of things is looking at Egbuka as number 4. Now, he was last week priced at 29.5. The under for his price was minus 115. That under at 29.5 is now minus 150. So Egbuka in the draft odds is getting bet down to go 29th or sooner. But based on the scout ranks that Bob McGinn has over at Go Long TD, he is wide receiver number 4. Burden, as we just talked about, was referenced by scouts between a first and a second round pick. In Egbuka's breakdown, there are multiple comments from multiple scouts that says second round makes total sense. He's a solid second rounder. And so it's a bit of a contrast between where the betting market is and where the scouts are kind of commenting on Egbuka. He's referenced as a great number 2 wide receiver, but probably isn't a number 1 wide receiver. And so not only do we put this hypothetical question out there of how would NFL scouts bet on the NFL draft, I think if you're basing it off of these comments, these scouts would be looking at his over, which is now at plus money. But when it comes to the positional totals, which we talked about on Friday, wide receiver selected in the first round over 2.5 is minus 270. While Tet's referenced as a number 1 guy, 16 to 25, that's the top wide receiver. So let's say he goes at the top end of that range. Matthew Golden's at 17.5 for his positional over-under. That seems like a very fair number. But if Luther Burden is referenced as a fringe first-round, second-round guy ranked as number 3, and I'm seeing Emeka Egbuka referenced as a second-rounder by multiple scouts, not only do I think they would be on that under for Egbuka specifically at 29.5, but I think they would also be on wide receivers under 2.5 at plus 205 in the first round, because I don't see any slam dunk number 3 wide receiver referenced by them. So that is how I would view them looking at that. Other guys mentioned Isaiah Bond was mentioned to have first round talent, but combined character and production, whether he goes in the first round, I don't know. Jaden Higgins was referenced as definitely in the conversation for the second round. Jake Beck was referenced as I don't think he can really run, third round at best. Savion Williams was a guy from TCU that stood out as having a first round resume, but there was a huge divide on him. There was another scout that says he's dropping more passes than anyone he's seen. And so that was a very conflicting report. Troy Horton was fourth round at best, and all the other guys fell way down the list. So really it's kind of centered around 4 guys. When you look at Tet, you look at Golden, You're looking at Burden and you're looking at Egbuka, but two of them are very firmly in the first round. Two of them, surprisingly, based on how some of these odds were moving, were definitely not by the comments. Let's go to tight ends as the next position up. Tyler Warren and Colston Loveland were the two guys that have been discussed in the first round really since the season ended back in December and into January, and we got into early draft talk. I found it interesting with Tyler Warren. I did a video on Friday saying that I'm looking at his over at 9.5 at minus 150, minus 160 because of how the top 10 is now taking on a bit of a different order with New Orleans changing their priorities and what that might look like. But Tyler Warren specifically, there was one scout that says, when people say he's going in the top 10, I think about guys like Kellen Winslow, Jeremy Shockey, Tony Gonzalez, but I don't see Tyler Warren that way. I see him more as a Dallas Clark, a Heath Miller, a really solid player. He's not flawless, but I have some reservations. There was another scout that said he's a conventional Y tight end, really talented, and Ys are hard to find, but I don't see him being a top 10 pick. So there's no speculation around Warren not going in the first round. He's viewed as the number one tight end, but some of these commentary spots suggest that top 10 is probably a bit of a reach for him. And so as we start to see this over at 9.5 drift, potentially see that go up a little bit more between now and draft next Thursday. And that's why I did the video on Friday. I just see it going that way. Now, I compare Colston Loveland to a very similar player in the wide receiver category with Matthew Golden. He's the number 2 guy, but there's no commentary here that's really overly positive, really overly negative, and there's nothing tying him to a specific range in the draft. What stood out to me that was interesting was hearing that he's viewed as a better route runner. He could develop into a similarly strong Y tight end like Tyler Warren, but it's going to take time. But he's not being written off in that way. And the only real concerns were his blocking, which is another thing that said could be developed. But then also at the combine, he was walking around with a brace because he had an AC joint injury. And so there was speculation that maybe that kind of scared things off a little bit, but not a lot of negativity around Loveland at all. So that was a different perspective that I saw as I was looking at his under 19.5. That's a price that's gone up, was around minus 175 this time last week. That under 19.5 is now out to minus 225 and trending a little bit higher. Other tight ends, Elijah Arroyo from Miami. He was listed as you can get him probably top of the second round and be pretty happy. Maybe first round. He's got playmaker talent. He's worth a first round pick from another scout. So you have Arroyo in that 30 to 45 bracket. Mason Taylor. There was a comment from a Twitter account last week that he was gaining steam and his stock was going up. During the season, you would have thought he was a third rounder, but now after you squeeze the draft, he's probably a solid second rounder, was a comment from a scout. So a different perspective there on Taylor, who sees his stock rising. Ryan Roberts with great comments. Any interesting comments on Fannin? One highlight line specifically, great timing as I scroll through this. So there was one line that stood out. His team and another graded Fannin in the 4th to 5th round range. He's so stiff, he's physically self-aware, and has figured out a way to overcome it. A dynamic route runner with tremendous instincts. He'll play and go higher, was the quote specifically on Harold Fannin. I appreciate you timing that up so well. Number of other tight ends there. I'll leave that for everybody who wants to see that over on Go Long TD for the draft guide with Bob McGinn. Let's get to offensive tackles. Will Campbell, number 1. There was speculation from scouts that he is going to be a better long-term guard in the NFL than a left tackle. There was no real range that he was tied to. There was nothing that stood out specifically. There was just doubts about his size, his arm length, and whether or not he is a true left tackle long-term in the NFL. Was rated very, very high. But the last comment is, I don't think he's that consistent of a guy that he's going to have a 12-year career and is going to 7 or 8 Pro Bowls. I don't see that. And so Will Campbell has been very much tied to the New England Patriots because of his left tackle position that he played in college. The Patriots desperately need a left tackle. Scouts in this preview that were commenting off the record think he is a better fit at guard than he is at tackle long-term in the NFL. Next up, and this is going to be surprising to some folks, number 2 in the offensive tackle ranking is Kelvin Banks. So all of the draft odds that have been posted have had Armand Membu as offensive lineman number 2 in the draft behind Will Campbell. In the scouting guide that was written up and all these comments, it is Kelvin Banks at number 2. So a difference in the rankings. Now, when we look at the draft position over-under, Kelvin Banks has been bet down. His price at 13.5 got as high as minus 190 to the under. That has since come in the other way. It is now under 13.5 at minus 165. Armand Membu has been bet over. We talked about it all last week. His over 6.5 price is now up to minus 380 on DraftKings. It is minus 475 on BetOnline. If you believe that BetOnline is dictating the market more than DraftKings is for these positional over-unders, if you're looking at that minus 380 at over 6.5 for Armand Membu, that is a price you're probably willing to take because it's going to go up. We saw that happen with Marion Hampton last week. All of these DK prices are catching up to BetOnline, and then we're seeing Ace Skins, 1BV, and other books that have these up start to follow BetOnline as well. So not only do I see that market adjusting and going up, I think we might see Membu get to the minus 500 range for his over, but that DK price is still short, and we're seeing Kelvin Banks listed ahead of him in this preview. Kelvin Banks was referenced as having the most value of all tackles in the draft based on scout comments. Now, the negatives for Membu. There was nothing overly positive when you're looking at his positional over-under at 6.5 that would say that he's a top 6 pick. He was referenced as he's a first-rounder, even though he's kind of a right tackle only. Another scout said, initially, I thought second round, but see him going in the first. Turns 21 on Wednesday. And so it's, for all of these other guys that are like sort of cemented in the top 5, there's been really strong commentary and everything that I'm reading. I don't see that with Membu, and I don't see a team in the top 6 that needs a full-on right tackle. That's the Jets at 7. And so that's why I'm saying I'm seeing the 6.5 continue to go up. I think that's going to continue to increase. Other tackles that stood out, it gets kind of messy. So the tackle from Minnesota, kid's going to be a starting left tackle. One scout says, another one says he's very stiff. If he's in the first round, he's going to be the 30th pick as a right tackle. Josh Connerly from Oregon was rated number 5. If you're asking a rookie to protect the blind side, he would be a really good option. Struggled in the Senior Bowl game. He'd be on my all overrated list. Josh Simmons suffered a torn patellar tendon in Game 6 and underwent season-ending surgery on October 12th. One scout says the knee would stop him from choosing him in the first round. Another one said these injuries can be longer than something like an ACL. It's definitely going to drop him. Another one said he's removed from consideration by one team, according to an executive, because of reservations around his character and makeup. There was another scout that had very choice words for him as a person and a character. Some of this gets pretty colorful. And again, I encourage anybody who's looking at the draft or betting it to go over and get this guide and support golongtd.com. Pretty colorful commentary around Josh Simmons, but between the injury and the commentary around his character, not a lot of hope from these scouts specifically on him being in the first round. Ozzie Trapillo from Boston College, a name I'm probably butchering pronunciation-wise. It would not surprise me if he slid deeper into the second round. He checks all the boxes, and not too many other guys are bleeps at a position where there aren't too many bleeps. You can fill in the blanks for that one. And then there was a comment, if you overdraft him at like 23 or something, you'd be like, oh boy. But if you get him in the third round or late in the second, you would be very excited about him. So from the tackles, Will Campbell, firmly in the first round, very likely going in the top 5. I think Membu is probably going to be in the top 10, but that over 6.5 is probably pricing him still a little bit shy of where he should be. Lots of positive comments for Kelvin Banks being the best value tackle of the first round. But then beyond that, for tackles, I think you see those 3 guys firmly in there. Beyond that, you're maybe looking at a 50-50 shot for one more based on the commentary. So keep that in mind as we go through and kind of tally up these offensive line guys. 3 offensive tackles firmly in the first round. I think if we're speculating on how these scouts would look at betting, they would probably be betting Membu over 6.5. They would probably be betting Kelvin Banks under 13.5. Next position up is offensive guards. Tyler Booker was the one guy that stood out from the guards. He's a pretty safe bet to be the first guard. He's a really good inline player for run and pass, a little bit more of a gap scheme than a run off the ball wide zone type. A guard like this, you could take him first round, said another scout. Another one said guards don't typically go in the first round, but he will. Another one says, I think I have him on the fringe of the second round, but you've got to find 32, and he may be one of those 32 only because he tested poorly, was the negative on him. So you have, I would say, offensive lineman number 4 in Tyler Booker as a slam dunk. Everyone else, the guard from Arizona, he's a borderline first rounder. Donovan Jackson, have him as a second round pick, one of the best run blockers. Maybe take him late round 1. And then there were other ones, third or fourth round type, third or fourth round. And then guys like Fairchild, Rivers, Jones, all of those guys were further down, not going in the first round. So really from that, Tyler Booker, first round, highly rated guard, that would get to 4 offensive linemen firmly in the first round. And then for centers, Gray Zabel is number 1, listed as a center. What was interesting about Gray Zabel is all of the commentary about him. And this is a guy where I have a lot highlighted about Gray Zabel because there were a lot of colorful comments. It was all kind of downplaying how good of an offensive lineman he is. Now, why I think this was so interesting to me is my draft analysis process to this point has been going on the NFL media conference call back in February, looking at all the mocks, listening to a ton of podcasts, going through NFL Daily, anything said by Todd McShay, anything said from Daniel Jeremiah. There's some other draft guides that I have been reading. Benjamin Solak retweeted a call out for draft guides, and there's a ton of them on Gumroad where it's the team draft guide and like independent authors or media companies are writing about one specific team, and it goes into just incredible detail. And so I've been kind of piecing all these things together, and I think in many ways that's a translation of other people doing very similar. Why this guide was so interesting to me was you get commentary from scouts working for teams who are just there to evaluate the players. They're not trying to necessarily like mock these guys to specific teams in certain places. And there's no like direct team reference to any of these because it's all anonymous. In some cases, you get AFC or NFC reference. And why I say that was interesting is because I've heard a lot of positivity everywhere about Gray Zabel being this interior offensive lineman in a draft kind of void at that position where he's going to solve a lot of problems for a lot of teams. And that was referenced in the commentary, but there was a lot of negativity about him. He was referenced as a third and fourth guy by a couple different scouts. He was graded lower than Cody Mauch, who was drafted from North Dakota State recently in the 40s, and he was given a lower grade than him. But this was all caveated by there's no centers in the draft, and Gray Zabel is going to go way higher than he should because he can play center. So we don't have any prices specifically on Gray Zabel, but he's tied to teams like Seattle and other interior offensive line needy teams. But based on how he is graded by these scouts compared to other sources that I'm looking at, there's a very big divide between the two. And so it seems like Zabel is going to firmly be offensive lineman number 5 going in the first round, but it seems like he could be a bit of a reach in an overdraft, but he's getting a lot of value here because he plays Zabel specifically. So first round, I think, is certainly safe for him, but it's interesting to see how low some of these guys were discussed, or how low some of these guys discussed him and his outlook. No one else in the breakdown. There were 6 different centers discussed, or anywhere close to the first round. So I bring this up because on the positional totals, total offensive linemen selected in the first round, the price is 6.5. We just talked about 5, I'll call them slam dunks, to go in the first round. There's a lot of variance with some of these tackles that you're going to need 2 of them to go in the first round to get the over. Under 6.5 is currently minus 200, which in the positional total show on Friday, I said that seems to be priced a little bit better than, I believe it was, wide receivers we were coming right out of. And so it's really, in the handicapping world, when you're looking at this offensive lineman price, I would say, in the hypothetical of if these scouts could bet on the draft, what would they do? They would probably be betting on the under, because there's a lot of these guys from the tackle group that you would need 2 of. I think you could read through it and justify one of them to make 6. Finding number 7, you have to be a little bit generous in interpreting some of these comments. And so I think if I was put in the hypothetical scenario, say, how would they do it? They would be betting under on the offensive lineman selected in the first round. Ron says, Zabel 2025, like Barton 2024, versatile, clear, first round safe. You were referencing Barton from Duke. That's the analysis on him for the most part. It's like he's on, if you're kind of pigeonholing him at one specific position, he's 3rd or 4th round, but because he can play center, because he can play along the interior, he's going to go way higher than he might warrant if he was stuck at one position. So that I agree with you. That makes him number 5. Quarterback. I don't have any massive takeaways here that are going to like shake anything up or be anything groundbreaking. I found the commentary very interesting to me, hearing it compared to others. Now, the quarterback class has been talked about since day one as being weaker than years past. It's a very different unit to last year and prior years. Cam Ward, when I think back to February, was not the consensus number 1 pick. It was going to be Abdul Carter to the Titans. And there was some commentary late February on the conference call of why would Tennessee do this in the AFC, where you need to have the absolute answer at number 1 to have any chance of competing with these other quarterbacks. That's kind of the same sentiment that was shared by the scouts in this commentary. One said Tennessee has to pick him at number 1, but I'm kind of laughing hearing he's going to go first. 2 years ago, he was throwing interceptions like nobody's business. There's about a page and a half on Cam Ward that stood out with negatives. His arm strength was viewed as the big positive, but there's a lot of doubt over Cam Ward. Now, this is not in any way to say he is not going to go number 1. I'm not going out on a limb here to stand in front of those odds and those numbers. That's the way that everything is looking and how it's being bet. But I found it interesting to read about such an important position and not really get a lot of positives about any of these guys. The one thing that stood out to me as I take a sip of coffee, for Cam Ward specifically, there was a quote in the middle that said he'll get sacked maybe 85 times in his rookie year. It was said in jest. He will set the records for sacks because he will not get rid of the football. He just holds it and drifts around, and the Wake Forest guy falls off him, and the NC State guy can't get him on the ground, and the Louisville guy is just grasping at air. It's laughable. It's not real. This guy is so unpolished. Here's why this is interesting. On the Ross Tucker podcast, and I'm very positive that it was Greg Cosell who had a comment about Caleb Williams and a study that he did where he was saying that one of the most difficult things to do for a college quarterback playing as a rookie in the NFL and even in the younger part of his career is overcome the willingness to take sacks by holding on the ball for too long. And that was the comment about Caleb Williams, who did it at the college level and couldn't get away from doing it at the pro level. Now, to see this stand out about Cam Ward specifically, thinking if he goes 1 to Tennessee, there's going to be a lot of hype and there's going to be a lot of excitement from it. But this being the standout commentary, along with everything else behind that offensive line that the Titans are going to have on the field week 1 if Cam Ward is drafted by them and becomes the starter, it kind of makes me think about a repeat of Williams last year and all the sacks he took applying over to Tennessee in the same way. And so I would encourage anybody who maybe hasn't seen that clip to go search it on YouTube, pull it up. That seems to apply to Cam Ward in this context as well. Next quarterback up was Shedeur Sanders. Said he'll start day 1 wherever he goes. There was doubts that he would be a top 10 pick. Quote was, the concern with him is at times he developed bad habits holding on to the ball for too long. It wasn't viewed as extensively as Cam Ward. Trying to always hit the home run instead of settling for singles and doubles. There was one scout that said he is the flashiest, most overhyped game manager I've ever graded. There's no way on earth he should go in the top 3. He's a second rounder at best, and he's going to go in the top 10. There's doubts about how high Sanders should be going. And this is probably reflective of everything that's been said so far. We've seen his over at 8.5 get bet up. That current price for his draft position total is 8.5 over minus 300. That was around minus 180 when we did the NFC show last Tuesday. Has continued to trend up. There has been doubts recently. I saw TA post about it. I saw John Degg in his ETR mock draft on Saturday talk about it. No one from the Saints went to Sanders' pro day. They attended Jackson Dart's pro day. Now, I've heard conflicting analysis on what that means. There's the case to be made that the teams have so much tape on a guy like Sanders that they don't need to fly out resources to be there live in attendance because they know what it is, whereas Dart is viewed as a bit different. Dart was also a lot more local to New Orleans, and so that wasn't necessarily like a definitive yes or no on whether or not the Saints could draft someone like him, because I would counter that with saying back in February on the conference call, the Saints were labeled as the best fit for Sanders, but perhaps not attending it. There's a lot of validity, and maybe they're not interested in him at that position. So a lot of indecisiveness on Sanders, but in the hypothetical, if I was going to say how are scouts going to bet this, if they could, they would probably be betting Sanders over 8.5 and doing so pretty comfortably. Now, other guys that stand out, Jackson Dart. He's a guy you take in the late second round or in the third. I don't believe this hocus pocus about putting him in the first, but stranger things have happened. A lot of this analysis was caveated by an opening paragraph that said it's a quarterback. It's so much more valuable. They're always going to go higher. Other comments on Dart. Someone will take him in the second round. He reminds me of a mini Drew Lock or Gardner Minshew. Is he better than Matt Corral? Yes. Matt went in the third round and was a retread thrower at this year's combine. Dart's value would be incredible in the fourth, but to take him in the second round means you're saying he is your starter in the future. I think the chances of that long term are low. Tyler Shuck has had 5 season-ending surgeries in 7 years of college. He's the most athletic. He ran 4.6. He throws it well. He's mature, but he is 26 in the fall. If Dart goes in the second round, Shuck is going to go in the third round despite the injury history. He's just unlucky. He is no throwaway. I have to go all the way to number 9 to find Jalen Milroe, who's caught a lot of first-round buzz recently. He's invited to attend the draft in person next Thursday. That typically has a pretty good correlation to guys going in the first round. It brought up a lot of uncertainty when it was announced. It brought up a lot of hype and like, what's going on here? Why is he being in attendance when we know he's not viewed as a first-round quarterback? And just like a guy like Brett Coleman, who did a great video on him, said in his analysis, and he was surprised to hear that, as well as others echoing that statement. There is nothing in these reports that would give any indication that he could go in the first round, nor should he go in the first round. There was one comment, if I'm stretching here, to be like, what's the case for Milroe in the first round? The one comment that stood out, he has the highest ceiling because of the athlete and how fast he is. And there was a lot about how fast he is, how great of an athlete he is, how great of a runner he is. But then he just gets absolutely trashed for throwing the football. He just can't play quarterback in the NFL, a fourth scout said. Just has no feel for the game. He can't throw. He's not accurate at all. He can run, but as a runner, he doesn't have any feel. He's just getting trashed for accuracy and so many concerns about his throwing. There was one comment that said he's at least 3 years away from being developed into a decent thrower. So everything about Jalen Milroe kind of echoes what is being said by film guys on YouTube that are dialed in and knows what's going on. Seems like that is a big stretch despite a lot of the hype that is being brought up. So how would they end up or how would the scouts in a hypothetical scenario end up betting on quarterbacks? Well, as we said, Sanders over 8.5 would probably a bet that they look at and they like quite a bit. When it comes to the positional totals in the first round, quarterbacks under 2.5 in the first round plus 340 sounds like something that would be considered. But again, all of this was caveated by it's quarterbacks. Teams are going to overdraft them. And so even though a lot of these guys are being discussed as not being fourth rounders, and there's over 2.5 quarterbacks in the first round, price is now all the way up to minus 475 from as low as 250 last week. You're just going to see teams reaching on some of these QBs, and we're probably going to see 3 go in the first round. So that might get dialed back a little bit. Ryan Roberts says, are comments here from all 32 teams, or is it a minimal sample size? Sorry if you're referenced. I logged in a few minutes late. So this is all anonymous. As I mentioned, if you're just tuning in, golongtd.com is where you can find this. It's Tyler Dunn's site. It's with Bob McGinn. He has about 120,000 words, and it is all anonymous scouts. Some of it's labeled AFC, NFC, but for the majority, it's just all anonymous scouts that are not referenced by team, not referenced by name, and it's all pretty honest commentary. And Bob McGinn has been writing about sports since the 70s, has a ton of connections, and does this draft guide annually. And so there's a lot of really colorful commentary throughout this. And again, for anybody who's tuning in, I could see this drawing upset comments. This is not implying at all that the NFL scouts are actually betting on the draft. This is me just saying, hey, here's a really well-written guide. This is different from the coach and GM commentary that's everywhere. It's different from the mock drafts. Here's a whole lot of colorful commentary from guys who do this for a living, who contributed anonymous thoughts. And here's what they're saying as another data point to put in to combine with everything else you're looking at for the draft and betting. Running backs, fun position in this draft. Now, all of these draft guides that Bob wrote, they have like a top blurb, and it kind of just gives like a summary of the position. There's an AFC and an NFC executive that were represented in this, which paint an interesting thing to think about when it comes to running backs. All of them kind of acknowledged that Genty is the best, but then there's 2 comments that stood out. The rest of these guys just throw them in a bag and mix them up and take them all. They're all good. Second round, third round picks. The order is pretty much all the same past Ashton Genty. Another team said one team categorized 11 running backs as NFL starters. With the group so tightly bunched, there's little urgency to draft the position early. Another one said, with it being so deep in the 3rd to 11 range, you're not going to take the 3rd guy if you value the 11th guy in the same threshold. This is from an AFC evaluator specifically. You can just get a guy later. And then another one from the NFC says you're going to get a really good player, maybe even day 3, because there's so many good ones this year. This is a really, really good group of running backs. And so the running back market specifically, over 2.5 is plus 120, under 2.5 is minus 150. For the last week we've been discussing it. It's been Genty 1, Hampton 2, And then last week on Thursday or Friday, Henderson jumped up and got a lot of hype and a lot of steam as he was trending towards the first round. Here on the show, we've been talking about Washington at 10-1 to draft a running back. That was Birdie's comment in the chat. That's yet to really take off. I think it might. And as we look through these running backs, I mean, Ashton Genty, clear consensus number one. One scout said if you draft him first overall, you're not wrong. He's that rare of an athlete and a prospect. And so there's no doubt there with Genty. I think, again, hypothetically, if you're wondering how these scouts are going to draft at the position, Genty under 9.5 at minus 240, I think would be something that they would absolutely agree on based on all the commentary, compared to Bijan Robinson, compared to LaDainian Tomlinson, compared to Emmitt Smith. I mean, it's just glowing praise for Ashton Genty and what he brings to a team. I think there would be a consensus among them that under 9.5 would be a bet that they would make. Then we get to Marion Hampton. This is where it gets interesting. One scout says, call him crazy, but he might consider taking him over Genty. And there were a number of reasons why. I'll leave that for the draft guide for those of you who want to go over to Go Long TD to check it out. There was one that said really good hands out of the backfield, looks the part, but has him in the third round. Would be shocked if he went in the first round. Very divisive at the position. And that continued through Henderson, through Johnson, through Judkins, through ETN, through Gordon. There's guys that rate some of these very highly. There's guys that rate them very lowly. I would say the commentary on Henderson from the scouts in general was a little more positive than what we saw from Hampton. But some of the comments included, I don't think he's going in the first. The durability is a big question, said another scout. I wouldn't put him in the first, but because his hands are good enough and he's a big play threat, I could see him going early in the second. Another scout said he's a mid-round type guy. So it's a very indecisive running back class, because the impression that I get from reading the comments is a lot of this group is very skilled. Some scouts maybe not willing to put their name on a running back that high up because of the position and how it's been valued over the last couple of years. And then again, other scouts are willing to do that because there's so much talent here and hype some of these guys up. And so if I was to put myself in the hypothetical and say, how are these scouts going to bet these running backs based on what we're seeing? The easiest consensus I think they would get to is Genty under 9.5 for his draft position. But I think when we're looking at running back specifically, they may be opposite of the show, where they could go under 2.5 running backs, as there seems to be, again, like based on what these executives said and how some of these scouts are looking at it, there's so many guys on day 2 and 3 that could be valued similarly in some of these draft rooms, that some of these teams are not going to have this overwhelming running back need with a guy that's, if they're going best player available, rated so much higher than other positions that might be more of a premium. They'll be willing to wait, and maybe you see some of these running backs slide. I know it's very popular to see Genty to the Raiders, Hampton to the Broncos, and then figuring out Henderson and where he might fall. That right now in the market is what's being handicapped, but that's not what is being said based on these scouts' comments, which, by the way, for those of you watching wondering how old these are, all of these have been quite recent, because there's workouts in certain dates in April that are being referenced for some guys. And so this is not like outdated stuff. This has all been published within the last 6 or 7 days, and all the comments are quite recent as well. So this has been a fun episode. We'll do defensive players tomorrow and go through them. And again, because there's going to be comments that inevitably come from this, this is not to imply that these NFL scouts are betting on the NFL draft. And this is not to imply that this is all 100% gospel and this is going to be how it plays out. I'm just doing this because there is, and I do it too, there is a ton of discussion about what coaches have said at pressers, what GMs have said at pressers, what top mock drafters have said, or where they mock, and all of those things have a big impact on the market. I think this is a very interesting additional data point that, at a minimum, if you go to golongtd.com and you buy the draft guide, you learn a lot about these players, a lot. And it's really helped me get a much better grasp on how some of these are and how some of these guys rate. So again, I would encourage anybody to go over and do it and to check it out. And tomorrow I will go through the defensive players, and I'm going to do my best to get Bob to pop on a live stream Wednesday or Thursday, hopefully, if he's able to do it. It might be pre-recorded and published after, but I would love to get his thought on here just to get some color on what it's like to hear from these guys, what he thinks, how this draft looks for him, because he's covered more drafts than I have been alive years on earth. And so I'll be curious to get his thoughts, and hopefully I'm able to get him here on the podcast at sometime this week to give everybody an additional piece of context. Appreciate everybody for stopping by. I hope everybody has an awesome Monday to start the week, and I will see each and every one of you back here tomorrow at the same time to do the same thing for all of the defensive players in the draft. Enjoy your day. We'll chat to you tomorrow.